have to respect your actors. When I directed Star Trek IV, I got a magnificent performance out of Bill because I respected him so much.
And when I directed Star Trek V, I got a magnificent performance out of me because I respected me so much.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Classic Comics, where I take a look at an episode of the original Star Trek series. This week, I'm going to be taking a look at By Any Other Name. And before I go any further, I'll say hello to Phantom Outsider. Hello, Fanny. Good to see you, sir. Thank you for stopping by. Hail to you. And if you are listening to the stream, please do hit the like button and sub to the channel while you're here. I would appreciate it. Okay, so By Any Other Name, and as always, I'll be looking or reading from Mark Cushman's book. These are the voyages for behind the scenes information on the episode. And By Any Other Name, I mean, it's okay. You know, I wouldn't count it as one of their great episodes. It's kind of in the middle somewhere. So I'll begin from Mark Cushman's book here. So this is, by the way, this episode written by D.C. Fontana and Jerome Bixby, and directed by Mark Daniels. So this is from an NBC press release. Captain Kirk answers a distress call, which turns out to be a ruse by a superior race to capture the Enterprise and its crew in By Any Other Name on Star Trek, Friday, February 23rd. A crew from an unknown galaxy, which is disintegrating, was sent out centuries earlier to conquer a new galaxy for its inhabitants. The current descendants, under leadership of Rojan, feel they have found this new galaxy in the Federation, but their own ship crashes and they need the Enterprise to make the return trip. Captain Kirk employs a simple but powerful method to prevent a takeover by Rojan. Barbara Boucher portrays Kalinda, and Stuart Moss is cast as Hanar, two of Rojan's allies. The real point of the story, that simple method employed by Kirk, involves the Kelvins' unfamiliarity with the human form that they have assumed. Kirk's only hope to find each of the Kelvins' Achilles heel is to find each of the Kelvins' Achilles heel, including an attempt to exploit the repressed affections between Rojan and Kalinda. The theme of this episode is a study in being human and the weaknesses and temptations that we must all learn to live with. All right. Let me take a drink of water right quick here. Hold on. Okay, and Phantom Outsider says, years later, this episode makes me laugh. Big rubbery body with suction cup and venom sacs behind the tongue. Andromeda aliens used to be huge creatures with many tentacles. Did they have suction cups or poison sacs? Kirk was determined to find out. Yeah, they do make mention in the episode of how of what they really look like. Spock says that due to his attempt at a mind meld. And I think it's interesting because it's kind of the first, I think, episode that kind of suggests maybe a Lovecraft influence, because certainly the way he describes the Kelvin's real form, it sounds something like a cosmic horror of some kind. And hail to FK8C 2005. Good to see you, sir. Thanks for being here. All right, so let's here we go. Okay, now we've seen the Enterprise taken over before by Khan in Space Seed and Norman in I Mud. What sets By Any Other Name apart is the means of the takeover and the unique circumstances regarding the invaders and assuming human form. By experiencing human feelings and desires, the aliens become less alien. The story was therefore different enough and interesting enough to be filmed, but the end results are mixed. Yeah, definitely. By Any Other Name suffers from an overused sci-fi premise. Alien invaders want to conquer Earth. Star Trek had always avoided this War of the Worlds type cliche until now, and the setup required more exposition that is normally necessary for us to understand the intent and capabilities of the antagonists. The who, what, and where results in too much talk. Also, because NBC wanted planet shows, a great deal of time is spent on Stage 10. To pacify the network, the cameras stay on the planet while we are told about the Enterprise being taken over. The equally tired and overused crew is held captive bit, this time in a cave, gives the landing party little to do except look for a means to escape. In A Taste of Armageddon, Spock used mental suggestion to have a guard think he and his fellow prisoners had escaped. He tries that again here. When this fails to gain them freedom, another old trick is used. One of the captives fakes an illness. We saw it in I, Mud and Bread and Circuses and countless other TV episodes of other shows from this era. Yeah, that's one of the things that really stands out to me in this episode is the whole, oh, please, my friend is sick, get help. It's like, come on. I mean, these are supposed to be these super intelligent aliens. Despite a so-so start, or excuse me, I'm sorry, no, the first act is further hampered by wooden performances and a planet set that cannot escape the quick-to-spot trappings of a stage, despite great effort and expense by Matt Jeffries. Once the story moves to the ship, things improve a bit. Unfortunately, that is where the majority of the episode takes place. Effective conflicts begin, as do the theme and visual elements which set the story apart. By Act 3, the comedy kicks in too, courtesy of Dorothy Fontana. Despite a so-so start by any other name, ends up being an entertaining and memorable Star Trek adventure. Yeah, I mean, they've even just gotten to the point like, if you remember in Thor: The Dark World, there was the "Let's do get help" bit, and it's the same thing. Oh, someone get help! My friend is sick, or whatever. Phantom Outsider says, I also point at this episode as one of the episodes that if there were a Section 31 in Roddenberry Trek, they'd show up, contact the Kelvins, and add or secure their tech and advancements to help this Federation. Yeah, that would make sense. All right. Let's get into this one here. Okay, so they're in orbit around a planet. I don't think the planet is ever really named. But a landing party beams down in response to a distress signal. But they initially find no evidence of a ship or of survivors. And then they are confronted by a man and a woman who tell Kirk to hand the Enterprise over to them. When Kirk protests, they use these devices that they have on their belts to paralyze Kirk and the others. Now, after releasing them, the male, whose name is Rojan, tells Kirk that they are members of the Kelvin Empire. And again, written by DC Fontana, Jerome Bixby, and then directed by Mark Daniels. So Mark Daniels is back. It's named Uranus. Fanny says, imagine we are the Borg and now the new, smaller, more compact Borg dodecahedron. How many Borg dexahedrons fit in a standard Borg sphere or cube? The world may never know. Yeah, it'd be interesting because they've done Borg ships with other shapes. I don't think they've ever done one with a dodecahedron, though. Okay, where was I? Okay, yeah. So after releasing them, the male Rojan tells Kirk they are members of the Kelvin Empire and they need the Enterprise to return to their home in the Andromeda Galaxy. They came from there because their home galaxy is experiencing increasing levels of radiation, and eventually they will no longer be able to survive there. They were sent to the Milky Way to determine if it could be a new home for them. Then he tells Kirk that the process of taking the Enterprise is already underway. And Fanny says, Mark Daniels, he's a Mark's D with no C. Hey, there you go. Actually, he does have a C. That's the thing. He's a Mark D with no K. Okay, so then we see some scenes of other Kelvins appearing on the Enterprise, and they use the freeze ray. Oh, and there's Lord Thoth, who says, "Hail! I just watched this on Monday." Oh, you mean in his last name, in the last name Daniels? Ah, okay, got it. Okay, and yeah, Kelvins. Yeah, what timeline is this? I wonder if this is where they got the Kelvin USS Kelvin name from. I mean, I guess they did. I don't know what else it would be. But yeah, we see them taking over the ship little by little. There's a female beams in, freezes a guy. Another guy appears on the bridge, freezes the bridge crew. Now, Kirk points out that the Enterprise will take thousands of years to reach the Andromeda Galaxy, but Rojan tells them that they'll modify the ship's engines so that they can make the trip more quickly in just, oh, say 300 years. The ship they came to the Milky Way galaxy in was a generational ship. They were born on it, and during the journey, and the return trip will be completed by their descendants. Kirk asks what happened to their ship, and Rojan tells him that their ship was damaged by an energy field at the edge of the galaxy. Of course, Kirk says, "Yeah, we know about that. This is the same energy field they encountered way back in Where No Man Has Gone Before." The pilot episode, or second pilot. Now, Kirk says there's no reason for them to do this by force and that they can work with the Federation to find a suitable world for colonization. But Rojan insists that the Kelvins don't colonize worlds, they conquer them. Then they take Kirk and the others prisoners, saying that it will make the crew more cooperative if they keep them hostage. Now, another Kelvin named Hanar shows up and tells Rojan that the needed modifications are being made to the ship's engines. And Phantom Outsider says, "Imagine all the extras this week. You just stand around. So instead of just milling around." Oh, okay. Yeah, well, originally there were going to be a lot more extras in this episode. And I'll get into that, later in the stream. But the original plan was, in early versions of the script, they didn't have this paralysis ray thing. And they weren't doing the like turning them into cube things. They basically had like a device that caused basically kind of like an agonizer or something. And they basically were going to torture the crew into obedience. But they eventually got rid of that. And I'm sure part of it was because of the expense, because this way they could get rid of all the extras and wouldn't have to pay for them. But I think originally it was because of the violence involved and just how were a half dozen people going to keep 400 crewmen under control through intimidation? You just have to think it's not going to work. Okay, now as Rojan and Hanar discuss what they discuss what they are experiencing and how uncomfortable it is being in these human bodies. Rojan speaks of how he dislikes being under an open sky and how he longs to be back on a ship in outer space. Meanwhile, the landing party is in a cave that's being used as a prison cell. And they're discussing how they could overpower the Kelvins, and they agree that they have to disable that paralysis ray that they use. The Kelvins mention that it utilizes a central projector, and they speculate that if the central projector could be disabled, that would deactivate all of their paralysis weapons. And then Kirk does something interesting. He makes reference to a previous episode, which rarely happens. In this case, he makes a reference to A Taste for Armageddon, when he mentions that in that episode, Spock used the Vulcan mind meld to trick a guard to believing that the cell was empty and that they had escaped, and he asks Spock if he could do that again. And Spock says he'll try it, so he tries to do it on the female Kalinda, who's standing guard. but instead he is violently thrown back when he tries to mind meld with her. Now she enters the prison and Kirk gets the drop on her and he gives her a karate chop to the neck, knocking her out. So then he gets her paralysis ray and they escape, but they only get a few feet before they are paralyzed again by Rojan and Hanar. Kalinda recovers and takes back her paralysis ray, and then Rojan declares that their behavior must be punished. And Lord Thaw says this was a great character development story. Yeah, it is definitely, particularly for Scotty. Scotty does get a good bit to do in this one, which he normally doesn't. And Phantom Outsider says, one of the extras in this episode, see that dude in the hall, dodecahedron in the hall? That was me. Okay, so Hanar takes the male red shirt. I think his name is Lieutenant Shea. And then the young female, her name is Lieutenant Tompkins or Thompson, Lieutenant Thompson. And this, her character in the original script or early scripts, this character had a much bigger role. And I'll talk about that again when we get into the behind the scenes stuff. But she was going to be one of the main characters in this episode originally. So Rojan tells Kirk that he will be punished by watching his crew members be punished. So Hanar uses that device on his belt to transform them into small polyhedrons. He then gives these to Rojan. Hold on. Here we go. He then gives these to Rojan. And then Rojan crushes one of them, telling Kirk that he has now just killed this person. Then they restore the other cube to life, and it turns out that the person killed was Lieutenant Thompson, the female, while the guard survived. And, this is probably a bit of a surprise. I'm sure that when they were originally watching this, the expectation was probably going to be that the guard would get killed. I mean, let's face it, he's black and he's a red shirt. So you're like, oh yeah, he's gonna die definitely. But no, it was the woman who was killed instead. Okay, now back in their cell, and Spock is really, or sorry, Kirk is really disturbed by. There's a lot of this in this episode. It's one of the episodes I think was notable that it's. You rarely see Kirk so helpless, because again and again in this episode, he's just got to stand by and watch his crew being killed, being changed into cubes, being abused in various ways, and there's just nothing he can do about it, having his ship stolen, etc. Now, Spock mentions that during the mind melt, he saw many images, including immense alien beings with 100 tentacles, and speculates that this is the Kelvin's true appearance, and that they must take human form in order to better operate a human starship like the Enterprise. And they never do really explain how they become human, how they get these human bodies. That's never explained. They just have them. Kind of similar to how they never explain how they built these caves. They just got it there ready. So Kirk asks if Spock could modify one of the neural analyzers in sickbay to counter the paralysis ray, because obviously the paralysis field affects the nerves. And so he's like, maybe this nerve analyzer device could be used to reverse the effect. Spock is uncertain, but he's willing to give it a try. And Fanny says their family is Harvey Cthulhu. Yeah. Is it appropriate to rub a crushed crew member's remains in your hands? Also, did Kirk wash his hands after that? Yeah, good point. Yeah, I mean, somebody must have pushed the button, I guess. And the cave was already there. They just added the bars. Yeah, I suppose. Now, Kirk mentions that Vulcans can go into a state of deep, almost death-like stasis, and asks Spock if he can do that now. Spock says that he can, and so he puts himself into a death-like trance. Then they pull the old help my friend is sick routine and get Hanar to beam McCoy and Spock up to the ship so that Spock can receive treatment. And Hanar's, he's like here, he got sick awfully sudden. That's one thing I have, or one of the issues I have with this episode is how gullible and kind of dumb the aliens are. The impression you get is that they're like these powerful intellects and that their science seems to be in advance of what the Federation has, yet they seem oddly kind of gullible. I don't know. Maybe you could boil it down to they just don't understand human behavior. But I don't know. I mean, why would they care if Spock is sick? It's like they clearly have no real regard for human life or see any value in human life. So why should they care if Spock is sick? I mean, why wouldn't they be like, yeah, okay, so what? It's not our problem. And Phantom Outsider says, what if they just cubed him? You mean like cubed him to halt the illness? Yeah, I mean, maybe. Okay, now on the Enterprise, Spock is taken to sickbay, and McCoy tells the Kelvin guard, I think his name is Hamar, or Tomar, that's his name, that Spock has Rigelian Cassava fever. And after giving him a hypo spray, says that he'll be all right. He just needs some rest for a couple of hours. The guard accepts this for some reason and tells McCoy not to leave sickbay, but then he leaves. So, how would you know if he stays or not? And that's another thing is how completely just kind of cavalier they are about keeping an eye on the Enterprise crew. They pretty much just let them all run loose and don't really do much until of course, they start cubing them to keep them under control. Now, Rojan tells Kirk that it's time to beam up to the ship and leave, but warns Kirk not to disobey, saying that he respects Kirk's sense of duty, but he has a duty to fulfill as well, and he won't allow Kirk to interfere. Then Kalinda brings Kirk a plant and asks her what it's called. Kirk tells her it's called a flower. She mentions that the flowers remind her of these crystals that grow in their world, and Kirk quotes the line from Shakespeare. I believe it's from Romeo and Juliet. A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, he said duty. Okay, so the Enterprise gets underway and quickly jumps out to Warp 11. Now, Kirk tells Rojan he's going to sickbay to check in on Mr. Spock, and Rojan's like, yeah, sure, go ahead. I'm sure you won't plot anything or try to take control of the ship back or anything while we're not watching you. Well, he told him don't leave sickbay because they were busy cubing everyone not in sick. Yeah, but they haven't done that yet, though. Okay, now when he gets to sickbay, they tell Kirk that the central projector has been installed in engineering, and so they plan to take this modified neural analyzer to jam the paralysis ray's effects. Kirk and Spock go down to engineering, and that's another thing is this neural analyzer, or sorry, the central projector for their paralysis beam. They just leave it sitting here unguarded. They're not keeping an eye on it at all. So while Kirk causes a distraction, Spock and Scotty attempt to jam the device. However, the metal casing around the projector is blocking the neural analyzer's effects. So basically, this isn't going to work. So then Scotty and Spock start discussing the matter, and they both agree there's really only one other option left. And so afterwards, they meet Kirk in the turbo lift. He asks if they were successful. They tell him they can't block the projector's paralysis ray. Then they tell Kirk that they have rigged the engines, so upon Kirk's order, they can flood them with positive energy. The barrier at the edge of the galaxy is negative energy, so if it comes into contact with the positive energy in the nacelles, the ship will be destroyed and the Kelvins will be killed. Of course, they will all be killed as well. And Kirk is somewhat dismayed by this, which is a little surprising. I mean, he's shown himself perfectly willing to blow up the ship on more than one occasion. So, for him to be so shocked at this idea, I don't know, it seemed a little out of character. Now, on the bridge, they approach the barrier, and when they enter it, Kirk just can't bring himself to actually give the destruct order. And hey, Ogwagnar. Hey, thanks for stopping by. Always good to see you, sir. Now, after passing through the barrier, Rojan tells Hanar to begin neutralization. And they got some nice updated effects for the barrier here. Obviously, it looks nice. Now, Kirk asks what that means, and Rojan says that there are too many humans for them to guard all of them effectively. Yeah, true. In addition, the food stores on the ship won't be sufficient if they all make the trip, so they will begin transforming all non-essential crew into these polyhedral shapes. They needed the crew to get through the barrier, but now they don't really need them anymore. Now, Kirk protests this, of course, but Rojan says the process is already underway. He begins by transforming Uhura into one of the little polyhedral shapes and then does the same to Chekhov. While the female Kelvin that's on the bridge, Drea, she zaps some other members of the bridge crew as well. Okay, so Phantom Outsider says, now were the crew that were cubed on duty while they were cubed, or did they get service time during their actual shifts? Good question. I don't know. I don't know how the Federation's regulations work in that regard. I would assume it would just be they'd be on duty for their designated shift and be considered off duty, maybe. I don't know. Or maybe just like they're on off duty for health reasons. Maybe that's how you would classify it. I don't know. Okay, now, and of course, again, Kirk has to just stand there and watch all this happen to his crew. And, he's just really kind of taking it hard because there's nothing he can do. He just has to sit there and watch it happen. Now, later, Kirk is in a hallway and he finds several blocks on the floor that used to be crew members. He's then confronted by Rojan, who suggests that this is a better fate for them than being blown up by the barrier as he and his crew had planned. Telling Kirk that, yeah, they knew all about it and they would have prevented it from happening. So even if Kirk had given the order, that wouldn't have worked anyway. Fanny says, currently held by aliens, but in Cuban. Yeah, so I guess you could say held prisoner, maybe. I guess that would work too. And Rojan also tells Kirk that they have modified the engine so that they can't be tampered with anymore. So Kirk goes to the mess hall and learns that he, Spock, Scotty, and McCoy are the only crew members left. And honestly, this is one of the things, another issue I have with the episode, is that they decide they're going to get rid of everyone except essential crew. Now, I can understand keeping Scotty around because, he knows the engines better than anybody. And I can also see keeping McCoy around because they have human bodies. So it would probably help to have someone with medical training around in case they get injured or something. And also Spock because he's, the science officer and he probably knows the sensors and a lot of the other ship systems very well. But why do they keep Kirk around? He's the captain. So what is his job? His job is to make decisions and then give people orders to carry out his decisions. But he's no longer in command or making the decisions. It's the Kelvins that are. So honestly, they don't really need him. And now I understand, of course, why he's there. He's the star of the show. He's the main character, more or less. So they're going to keep him around. But it doesn't really make sense that they don't just cube him and leave him that way as well. Yeah, and Fanny says you're just going to leave them strewn around. Someone could trip on them. Yeah, I was thinking about how you'd have to be careful how you're walking through the through the hallways. You might actually step on a fellow crew member and kill them. Okay, so now one of the Kelvins enters, Tomar, and he sees them eating, and he asks them why they bother to consume food, asserting that the food pills that they have are much more efficient. Now, McCoy says that he should knock it before trying it, and the Kelvin insists that McCoy show him how to use the food replicators. So McCoy orders him some food, and so he starts eating. So Fanny says they kept Kirk around to demoralize the others. Okay, yeah, maybe. Now, when he notices the Kelvin enjoying his meal, Spock speculates that while the Kelvins have vast intellects, they have sacrificed other parts of their minds, including their senses, so they shouldn't enjoy the taste of food. But since they now have human bodies, they're now reacting to external stimulation the way humans would. Kirk speculates that since they are unaccustomed to this sort of stimulation, they may be able to use that against them by just stimulating them to distract them long enough to get their paralysis devices from them. And Scotty says that he has a way to do that. And so he approaches Tomar and offers to take him to his quarters and show him, give him some saurian brandy. And Phantom Outsider says McCoy could have scanned the Kelvin, seen if he had any allergies before he fed him that PB&J. Okay, now meanwhile, McCoy, he goes to, for some reason, he convinces Hanar that Hanar is anemic. And so he gives Hanar some, what he calls vitamin injections. In Scotty's quarters, he and Tomar finish off the saurian brandy. Meanwhile, Kirk goes to Kalinda, and he stimulates her, if you know what I mean. And while they're kissing, Rojan enters, and he doesn't seem pleased that they're together. After Kirk leaves, Kalinda kisses Rojan, and he's amused at how odd human behavior is. And Wagner says, is this the original Kelvin timeline? Yeah, we kind of talked about that. Phantom Outsider, so Kirk's plan was to get the Lady Kelvin to become sex crazed. Well, isn't that like, it's not like this is the only episode where, the plot hinges on Kirk being just, too irresistible. Now, later, we see Scotty and Tomar in Scotty's quarters again, and they're finishing off another bottle of something. Then we see Rojan and Spock playing chess, and Rojan expresses puzzlement at the way humans press their lips together. Spock tells him that this is usually done between humans that have great affection for each other. Rojan insists that Kalinda has no affection for Kirk. Spock asks if Kirk's interest in Kalinda makes him jealous or upsets him, and Rojan insists that he has no romantic interests in her and it doesn't bother him. Now, back in Scotty's quarters, Scotty gets another bottle of liquor, which is green in color. And when the Kelvin asks what it is, Scotty responds, it's It's green. Now, later, Rojan goes to Kalinda's quarters and tells her not to fraternize with the humans anymore, particularly Kirk. She asks why, and he says that they have strange ideas and they shouldn't let the humans' behavior affect them. She asks if he has told this to any of the other Kelvins, and he says no, only her. So she tells him that she's a strong, independent woman and she can see whoever she wants to see. And Rojan gets upset with this, which again is kind of unusual for them. They've been pretty emotionally, not quite like Vulcans, but emotionally pretty kind of stable. Now in sick bay, he's giving Hanar another dose of vitamins. Fanny says Rojan is very odd. It is very odd, but like Batman 66, Rojan finds a stirring under his jumpsuit belt. Well, maybe he'd have to take those pills that Adam West and Burt Ward had to take, to shrink their nether regions, so they wouldn't have bulges on network TV. Okay, and then back to Scotty's quarters. They have finished off the green stuff, and Tomar still wants more liquor. So Scotty gets a bottle of old Scotch whiskey that he was saving, and they start drinking it. Now, in the mess hall, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are talking, and McCoy reveals that he's actually been giving Hanar, what was it, Torazine? He's giving him some kind of a stimulant. It's not vitamins. It's some stimulant that's basically like adrenaline or something that's making him edgy and making him kind of irritable. Then we go to the bridge and we see Hanar confront Rojan and challenge his authority and question his decisions. Then back in the mess hall, Kalinda approaches Kirk and says she'd like Kirk to apologize to her some more. Now, Spock goes to the bridge, and Rojan asks Spock where Kirk is, and Spock tells him that Kirk and Kalinda are together in the rec room. Rojan is angered by this, and he leaves. In Scotty's quarters, Tomar and Scotty finish off the scotch, and then finally, Tomar passes out. And Fanty said only Ward had to take. Oh, was it just Burt Ward? I thought it was both of them. And then this is the first time McCoy threw out the Hippocratic Oath. Yeah, I guess it is. I can't remember any other time necessarily. Although, like I was saying in the previous episode, he's holding people guard with a machine gun. It's like, would he really have shot them with the machine gun? I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have. So Scotty then triumphantly takes Tomar's paralysis device, but then he's unable to get out of his quarters. I love this little bit here when he's approaching the door and he just sort of slumps against the door and passes out. That's the funniest part of it, in my opinion. Okay, now in the rec room, Rojan confronts Kirk and Kalinda. He tells Kalinda to stay away from Kirk, but she refuses again. Then Kirk and Rojan get into a fight. And as they're fighting, Kirk tells Rojan that the Kelvins are now stuck in their human forms and their descendants will have human forms too. And they're already becoming more and more human. And if this trip takes 300 years, by the time they get back to the Andromeda Galaxy, their descendants are going to be human for all practical purposes. And they'll be aliens to their own people. Now, Kirk suggests that the Federation can provide them with worlds to colonize, which again, he had suggested that at the beginning of the episode, but Rojan had refused. But this time, Rojan is more willing to listen and asks You would welcome an enemy, and of course Kirk says no, but we would welcome friends. So he accepts this offer. Spock notes that a robot ship can be programmed and sent to the Andromeda Galaxy to inform his people of this proposal. And so and then Kalinda kisses him. And again, he's still kind of confused by the whole thing. But he returns command of the ship to Kirk, who orders them back to the Milky Way. And it ends there. And I went back and forth on this one with a C plus or B minus. I guess I'll settle for C plus. It's a decent episode, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't quite add up, in my opinion, and things that are some plot holes that don't make sense. But it is an enjoyable episode. At least kind of the second half. The first half is kind of slow. All right. Okay. Let me take a drink of water right quick here. All right. Now, again, this was written by D.C. Fontana and Jerome Bixby from a story by Jerome Bixby. Now, Jerome Bixby is definitely a notable writer because he wrote Mirror, Mirror. That's probably his most famous episode. And Fanny says, Rojan thought about it and was like, if I stay here, Kirk will leave and I get the girl. Deal. Yeah. Jerome Bixby so dazzled the Star Trek staff with his original story for Mirror, Mirror that he was given a second assignment before even beginning the screenplay for that episode. He had written 2 drafts of his story outline for Mirror, Mirror when NBC rejected the property, citing that it was too hard to follow. While Roddenberry wrote a 3rd draft of the treatment, Bixby began thinking of other possible stories he could submit. Roddenberry's treatment of Mirror, Mirror got NBC's Stan Robertson to reverse his position, and Bixby was asked in for a meeting to discuss how to proceed with the script. Before leaving the studio that day in early April of 1967, Bixby pitched his idea for By Any Other Name. He went home and not only with a go-ahead to write the script for Mirror, Mirror, but a contract to begin work on the story outline for his second assignment. For the next 5 months, he divided his time between the 2 projects. Surprisingly, Bixby turned in his treatment for By Any Other Name before his first draft for Mirror, Mirror. The title of the new story came from Shakespeare, a line from Romeo and Juliet that reads, "What's in a name that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." The expression is often used to convey the idea that although you can change the name of something, the nature of a person or thing will remain the same. In this story, they're called the Kelvins in later drafts, but early on they were called the Davinians. They take on human form, but they are anything but human. Dorothy Fontana said, quote, "The thing that may have sold that story was the idea of these are aliens, but what do they feel? Can we make them feel as human beings? What can we do to them to make them understand who we are?" Bixby's story outline from April 27, 1967 had more than that to it. Knowing the journey home will take nearly 300 years and needing the crew to serve them on the Enterprise, the Davinians order the humans to reproduce so that they may provide future generations of crew slaves. In the end, without any intentional prompting from the humans, the Davinians begin succumbing to their newfound human bodies and the weaknesses of the human condition, prompting them to become less efficient, dropping their guard and allowing Kirk and his crew to regain control of the ship. Roddenberry had written a story somewhat like this back in 1956. A TV anthology episode called The Secret Weapon of 117. In this 30-minute episode, which starred Ricardo Montalban, Khan himself, and Susan Morrow as a couple from outer space who are sent to spy on Earth's defenses. The pair, transformed from their original alien state into human male and female, soon discover that their newfound human biology interferes with the mission. In the end, they fall in love and abandon their duty in order to live as humans. The story was structured in the style of a Twilight Zone episode, a quick setup, 20 minutes or so of character conflict, followed by a short ending. In time, after a few more drafts, the aliens would have a device enabling them to paralyze their enemies, and in even later drafts, a second device used to change their enemy's form into a small block of freeze-dried chemicals. But no one had any of these problem-solving ideas yet. Everyone's attention was far more focused on the first draft script for Mirror Mirror and all the other time-urgent properties during this 4-week period. Therefore, it was Justman who had the germ of an idea that would lead to the best scenes in the episode, although DC Fontana would be the one to visualize and write them. Kirk romancing Kalinda and arousing homicidal jealousy in Rojan. McCoy shooting Hanar full of vitamins or stimulants, thus making him edgy and driving him to challenge Rodan. And Scotty introducing Tomar to the joys of alcohol. So it was Justman's idea that they have the aliens be sort of distracted and overcome by their human sensations. That was actually his idea. And Fanny says, imagine a correctly oriented Section 31 that tapped into the Kelvin propulsion and weapons tech. That would make fighting the Borg very much easier. Yeah, it would. Now, many of Justman's concerns were addressed in Bixby's revised story outline on June 7th, while the staff was anxiously waiting for the writer to revise a script for Mirror Mirror. Some of Roddenberry's ideas were added in as well, including more drama concerning the crew slaves being forced to mate with one another. Kirk is specifically instructed to have sex with a female crew member named Leslie Thompson. So, well, if I can. Okay, well, I thought I had a close up of her, but like I said, this character, Leslie Thompson, she had a much bigger role in earlier episodes. And I'm guessing she probably would have been played by an older actress because the actress doing it was just 19 in this episode. And Fanny says all the Borg are paralyzed if the Borg are cubed. Also, Warp 17, which was probably a theoretical as it was not everywhere in the universe all at once. Yeah, well, the whole thing with the trans warp and it's again, this is one of these confusing things. They have a different warp scale. I'm sure you know this, but they've got an old warp scale in the original show, and then warp drive has been rescaled in the next generation period. I don't remember how exactly the scale changes, like what was warp 10 in the old scale that it is in the new scale. I don't know. Kuhn instructed Bixby to add more science fiction, more sexual tension, and more torture. Also, per Roddenberry's previous request to use the story as a means of stripping the lead Star Trek characters to their basic impulses and revealing their hidden sides, as had been done in The Naked Time. The torturing of Kirk then would result in the near complete collapse of the captain. Yeah, so before they had the paralysis ray, they had some device, again, kind of like agonizers, and they were torturing the crew into obedience. Before these changes could be made, Dorothy Fontana contacted Kuhn on June 12th, writing to him, quote, the question of mating Enterprise people has come up in other scripts. We did it last year in The Menagerie and are doing it again this year in Gamesters of Triskelion. I question if we need it again. Agreed, we're all big boys and girls, but frankly, Kirk's image starts to trouble me a lot when we have him succumbing to, quote, nervous needs midway through the episode and then walking away from the girl at the end as if she meant nothing to him. It makes him seem like a bit of a bastard to me, and I don't care if he has, quote, elevated her from a girl to a woman. That kind of line is a large pile of baloney. Kuhn gave Bixby additional instructions to cut out the baloney, but the mating gimmick stayed in for the time being. One change would have Kirk not succumbing to nervous needs and thereby refusing to make love to Lieutenant Thompson. She is resistant as well, admitting to him that she loves another. Per Roddenberry's request, Kirk's decision to turn the ship over to the Davinians is weighing heavily on him, and the thought of making love to a pretty woman is the furthest thing from his mind. Bixby was given further notes, then sent off to write his screenplay for By Any Other Name as Dorothy Fontana took charge of rewriting Mirror Mirror. The first draft of the former was delivered on July 31st. Still present despite NBC's strong objection was Kirk being picked to mate with Lieutenant Thompson. Also still present was the execution of dozens of Enterprise crew members while a pained Kirk is forced to watch, and the news that even more crew members have been killed by being herded onto the shuttlecraft deck and then flushed out into space. And Fanny says, right, but Andromeda Galaxy is 2.5 million light years away, so even 300 years is orders beyond Voyager's speed, as they were 70,000 light years away, and it would take 70 years. Yeah, okay, good point. Okay, where was I? I completely lost my place here. Okay, so the other one Kuhn referred to was yet another story. Oh, wait, let me backtrack. Okay, so around this time, Bixby was given submitted another story. This one was titled The Magic Stone. And this was received and given story notes by Dorothy Fontana during the second week of August. And this will be dealt with more when I cover the episode The Day of the Dove. It took Bixby nearly 6 weeks to get it right. And this is By Any Other Name we're talking about. By then, Gene Kuhn, while still working in the Star Trek offices, had been replaced as producer and showrunner by John Meredith Lucas. Fontana and Justman were not enthusiastic about Bixby's rewrite. On September 12th, Justman made this clear to new producer Lucas, writing, quote, I don't feel we have the sort of rewrite we were expecting from Jerome Bixby. The new producer felt that By Any Other Name had more going against it than for it. Jerome Bixby later said, quote, I wrote a story, they liked it, but then I did a script and they didn't like it, and looking back, I can see why. I did the one thing that Roddenberry was most against. He once said, don't become obsessed with the immensity of it all. And I did. I dealt extensively with all this subjective stuff produced in man's loneliness, disorientation, grief, and isolation, and I gave them 45 pages of the immensity of it all. And so Dorothy Fontana, without my knowledge, started to do a rewrite. Fanny says, so Voyager could go 1,000 light years in 1 year. The Kelvins had the Enterprise modified to go to 83,000 plus light years in a year. With the Kelvins mods, Voyager was less than 1 year from Earth. Yeah, good point. I never really did the math on that. I mean, honestly, another galaxy, it is so far away. You know, it's so immensely far. It's just, at a certain point, the numbers just get kind of abstract. Okay, now Fontana said By Any Other Name was a major rewrite. Bixby was a good writer, but it wasn't working for Star Trek. We had no right to ask for more than a light polish after the second draft was in, but it needed a rewrite badly. That's That's what they were paying us to do. And that's what Gene Kuhn and I did a lot of. Fontana said, quote, the biggest problem we had was how half a dozen people could take over a starship with a crew of over 400. How do we do this? And Gene Kuhn and I wrestled with it and we booted it around and we tried and tried, but we just couldn't figure it out. How the heck do you get a half dozen people to overcome 400 and put them in thrall except for the essential bridge crew that were needed? So we walked into Gene's office and we explained the problem. Now, he had on his desk this kind of piece of Mexican onyx that was cut in an octagonal shape. I had bought it and brought it back to him as a gift from a trip down to Mexico. And he used it as a paperweight on his desk. And so he picked it up and said, well, what if they had a machine that could turn people into a shape that was something like this? And it works for me. So once we got that licked, everything was fine, because all you had to deal with was the immediate characters. And once we had that gimmick in place, it all worked. We didn't have to have the extras around so much. Actually, that's where we saved a lot of money. It was primarily a bottle show, except for that bit at the beginning on the planet. We didn't have a whole lot of special effects except for the barrier, which was just reused footage from Where No Man Has Gone Before, and the normal flyby shots and stuff like that. So it wound up being a relatively inexpensive show to do. So that's, I guess, where these shapes came from, is they're inspired by this paperweight that Roddenberry had on his desk. The Divinians were now called the Kelvins, and now that the Kelvins had a means of controlling the Enterprise crew, there was no longer a need for the cruel instances of torture and intimidation that NBC was against. And with the crew members reduced to crystallized blocks, there was no need for them to be forced to breed with one another in order to assure future generations of slaves to run the ship. NBC's other objection, and one Fontana had due to the similarities between that aspect of this property and Gamesters of Triskelion, had also been resolved. Fontana's rewrite, designated as the final draft, was delivered on October 31st, with a revised final draft arriving on November 7th. Joan Pierce of DeForest Research, knowing that this was a rush job in order to keep the cameras rolling, hurried her notes back to John Meredith Lucas later the same day. As for the Kelvin's ability to freeze the landing party members, Pierce, after confirming with the firm's science authority, Peter Sloman, wrote, quote, if all the nerve impulses are paralyzed, then the organism would die because the autonomic as well as voluntary muscles will be affected. I suggest that it's a selective field that neutralizes voluntary muscles and voluntary nerve impulses only. And there is that line in the script when they're first paralyzed. Rojan says something about that, about how your voluntary muscles have been frozen or some such. Where's a good shot? Yeah, there you go. And Fanny says, also, with only 6 Kelvins, how are they supposed to colonize anything? I mean, we only see one female Kelvin. Well, there's 2. There's Kalinda, and then there's the other female Drea. There should be a shot of her in here. There she is. So there were 2, actually. Although it would still be awkward. Okay. Where was I? Okay. Also, regarding dialogue in the script stating that the journey would take 300 years, Pierce wrote, quote, if warp 14 equates to 8,192 times the speed of light, then the precise figure announced by Mr. Scott of 280 years will enable time to travel at warp 14 a total distance of 2,293,760 light years, slightly farther than the actual distance to the nebula in Andromeda, M31. M31 is about 2,200,000 light years distance, the furthest object naked to the visible eye. So 2 guys get nobody. Yeah, well, I'm trying to remember if there were, or there may be just 5, because we got Rojan, we've got Hanar, Then we got Tomar. So I think there's just 3. So there's 5 of them altogether, 3 females and 2 females, I think. So I don't know. Maybe Tomar would be the one, the odd man out. I don't know. No other produced science fiction bothered to put their scripts through this level of scrutiny. But Gene Roddenberry had insisted on it, and the creative staff understood the importance of complying. Regarding the line of dialogue, there is a strange energy barrier at the rim of your galaxy. Pierce wrote, quote, there is no scientific justification for this element in the story that our galaxy or any other has a defined rim, also without astronomical support. Present thinking is that the stellar population gradually diminishes. The edge of the galaxy concept was the major scientific criticism made of Star Trek, of the Star Trek episode Where No Man Has Gone Before by Isaac Asimov in the TV Guide article on televised science fiction. Asimov, later to become a fan of the show, had blasted Star Trek on this plot device. Despite this, the barrier at the edge of the galaxy had already been established, and the use of stock footage from the second pilot would save the series substantial expense, so it stayed in. And Fanny says, see, that's a case where if you had Section 31, they go live with them, create families, steal their tech. Yeah, maybe. Joan Pierce's notes were received on the morning of Wednesday, November 8th. There was no time for a complete rewrite. The episode was due to begin production on Friday, bright and early. Lucas hurried the script through a series of page revisions to address some of Pearson's comments and ignore others, with pages dated from later that Wednesday, then again on Thursday, then again on Friday, November 10th, as the cameras began rolling. And finally on Monday, November 13th, the second day of filming. Fontana's reimagined script, both clever and entertaining, was filmed with no major changes. Fontana had turned down writing credit on Cat's Paw, Wolf in the Fold, and The Changeling, even though her producer bosses believed she did enough rewriting to warrant acknowledgement. This time, however, with the substantial retooling, she was given co-writing credit with Bixby, which we see here at the beginning. 3 things stood out about the final script in Fontana's mind. First was the contribution by Roddenberry, the idea to turn the crew into little blocks of a condensed material. The second came from Kuhn, of which Fontana said, this is Gene Kuhn's suggestion at the beginning where you see these 2 people, the man and the woman, a science guy and a science person and a security person boiled down to their basic elements, and then one of them is crushed, and you figure it's going to be the security guy, but it isn't. It's the woman that's killed. She dies. And the third thing that tickled Fontana was her own design. She said the idea of using the growing humanity of them because they were not familiar with the sensations, that one turned out to be a lot of fun, and we got to play a lot with those. Okay. Let me take a drink of water again right quick. I'm at an hour already, or over an hour. Okay, now Warren Stevens, there he is. He was cast as Rojan. He was 48 years old. He had worked often in television and film beginning in 1949. Now, here's an interesting little Star Trek factoid. I think it's pretty well recognized now that Forbidden Planet was probably one of the key inspirations for Star Trek, because the ship in there with Leslie Nielsen as captain seems almost like a kind of proto-Federation in a way. And Warren Stevens actually played the ship's doctor in Forbidden Planet. He basically was kind of the prototype for McCoy, which is interesting. And Fanny says, at least the security guy was able to get his phaser out. It gave a sense that he was good at his job. Yeah, he's pretty aggressive. Like there's one point where he's plotting about how to take them down or something, and Kirk has to kind of like say, you'll do that when you're ordered, mister. Let's see. He also appeared on TV in The Outer Limits, The Twilight Zone, and Voyage of the Bottom of the Sea. Stevens was so well respected and popular during this time that for several years running, he was averaging one prominent guest star appearance on TV every month. Stevens said, quote, I was doing an episode of Bonanza with Mark Daniels, who was directing. And at one point during the last days of filming, I asked, so where are you going next, Mark? And he said, I love how he phrased it here. I have to go do one of those Star Trek things. He doesn't sound very enthusiastic. I have to go do one of these Star Trek things. Blah. And I said, oh, you know what? They owe me one over there. And it's true. I forgot why, but they owed me a show over at Paramount. Well, we finished the Bonanza. And then about a week later, I got a call from Paramount. Mark was going to do this thing. And that's how I did the Star Trek episode because I remembered that they owed me a show. Barbara Boucher. I find it good. Go the other way. Well, I'm trying to find a good. I guess that's as good a shot of her as any. She was cast as Kalinda. She was 24 at the time, a former beauty contestant winner. Boucher broke into show business as a model in TV commercials. She was also, oh, and this is another interesting little factoid. So she was actually the former girlfriend of James Darren, who was starring on Time Tunnel around this period of time. But of course, he in the 90s, he would appear on Deep Space Nine as the holographic lounge singer. I forget the guy, Nick Fontaine, isn't that? I think that's it, Nick Fontaine. So apparently, he and Boucher they dated for a while, and she dated Shatner for a while too. Apparently, Boucher's career was catching fire at the time that she did the Star Trek episode. In 1965, she was the female lead in Stony, and did another film in 1970 called Red Hot Shots. Shortly after that, fed up with all these sex pot roles she was being offered in Hollywood, Boucher moved to Italy, where she became a major star in Italian cinema. And they don't mention it, but they've got a photo in the book here of David Niven and Boucher, which apparently was in Casino Royale. I had forgotten she was in that. And man, she looks great in this photo, too. She was a stunner. Now, Stuart Moss as Hanar. Let's see if I can bring him up here. There he is. He was 29, and he was the Kelvin who becomes unglued with the help of McCoy's stimulants. He was making his second appearance in a Star Trek episode. As Joe Tormolin, he died by stabbing himself with a butter knife in The Naked Time. So if you remember that in The Naked Time, of course, there's a guy who pulls out a knife, and I think he threatens Riley, Lieutenant Riley, doesn't he? I remember he pulls the knife, and I think Sulu and Riley are trying to calm him down, and then he stabs himself with the butter knife. He was very busy in television around this time. Moss appeared in 8 episodes of Hogan's Heroes, along with guest spots on The Fugitive, Rawhide, 12 O'Clock High, Bonanza, Perry Mason, and The Invaders. Regarding his return to Star Trek, Moss said, quote, I was a big sci-fi fan before Star Trek. I had read most, if not all, of Heinlein, Bradbury, Sturgeon, Asimov, etc., so I saw most, if not all, of the first-year episodes. The writing was first class and groundbreaking. Moss had been impressed with the script for Naked Time. Regarding any other name, he said it was good but not noteworthy. Okay, now Leslie Dalton played Drea. Let's see if I can bring her up again. Is she here? Thought there was some of her in here. There we go. Okay, she was 24. Her agent, Angela Levy, the daughter of famous Hollywood talent agent Bessie Lou, had an in with Mark Daniels and was able to arrange an audition. Dalton recalled, quote, "I had seen Star Trek and really loved the show. I remember being asked into the office with Gene Roddenberry and somebody else, and Mark was there. At the end, very dramatically, I said, I think Star Trek is one of the grandest programs on television. There was a moment of silence. Then Gene looked at me very serious and said, Thank you. Thank you very much. And I knew he meant it. Here I was, this little girl barely out of drama school, and he was beyond gracious and totally sincere. As he often did, Roddenberry left the final casting decision up to his director. Daniels wanted to continue looking. Quote, the first time I showed up for the audition, I came with a very nice outfit, almost East Coast in style, Dalton remembered. It was orange and it was a very classy outfit, and I wore orange heels. Uh, and when I came back from the audition, Angela said, You didn't get it. Mark thinks you're not sexy enough. And she said, I'm going to talk to him into letting you go back. Wear something really sexy this time. So I thought, I'll show them. And I put on fishnet stockings, spike heels, and a mini skirt that was a good 6 inches above the knee, and a little tank top that showed cleavage down the middle of the chest. Mark was expecting me, but not the way I looked. I walked into the room and it was like Mark reeled back. He took a step back like a wind had hit him. It was the funniest reaction. He looked at me and he said, Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I left and called, and Angela said, Yeah, you got the part. And they have a photo here. Again, they don't mention it, but she was in those Matt Helm movies that Dean Martin did. Matt Helm films. In the 1970s, she would make numerous appearances on TV shows such as SWAT and Switch before joining the cast of The Guiding Light in the early 80s. Robert Fortier was Tomar. Let me see. There he is. Robert Fortier was Tomar. At 41, he had appeared in 3 episodes of The Outer Limits, including the classic episode Demon with a Glass Hand, as an alien named Budge. And of course, Demon with a Glass Hand is one of the episodes that is, I think, largely believed to be at least partly the inspiration for the Terminator films. During his successful career in television, Fortier made multiple appearances on the Loretta Young Show, Gunsmoke, and Combat. He had a recurring role in the Western The Gallant Men as Major Jurgens, and prior to Star Trek, he worked with William Shatner in the unsold pilot for Alexander the Great. And of course, that's the one where Shatner played Alexander the Great now, and Adam West was one of his generals. Julie Cobb played Leslie Thompson. Okay, let me go back here. And she's the one who gets turned into a cube and crushed. There she is. She was the only crew woman in red to ever be killed on Star Trek. She was making her dramatic TV debut in this role. She said, quote, I had done a few TV commercials a couple of years before for Heinz Ketchup, but Star Trek was my first SAG television job. It was a big deal for me to get that role. My parents, film and TV star Lee J. Cobb and stage actress Helen Beverly, were both okay with me wanting to act, but I didn't get that role because of my dad. I was just going on auditions in those days, reading for things. And I met with Joe DaGosta and Mark Daniels, and I got the part. So my first real job in TV became a classic. And Lee J. Cobb, the main thing I think of with him, of course, is he played Lieutenant Kinderman in The Exorcist. Although that's just, one small role. I think he was in 12 Angry Men, too, I think, wasn't he? I'd have to check. 100 more jobs would follow, including recurring roles on Growing Pains, Magnum PI as Thomas Magnum's cousin Karen, and 22 episodes of Charles in Charge. One of her proudest moments was when she was able to act with her famous father, Cobb, Lee J. Cobb. She said, 2 years before he passed away, my dad and I did a classic episode of Gunsmoke together called The Colonel. He was heartbreaking in it. And then Carl Bird played Lieutenant Shea. Come on. Okay, it's in the next one. Hold on here. There we go. Okay. Carl Bird played Lieutenant Shea, the red shirt who survives on the planet while Julie Cobb's character dies. His acting career spanned 1967 to 1984 and included appearances on I Dream of Jeannie, The Flying Nun, Gomer Pyle, and Julia. Now, in charge of the camera crew for this episode was cinematographer Keith Smith, who stepped in at the last minute to replace the ailing Jerry Thinnerman. Working hard to maintain the visual integrity of Star Trek, Smith received the ultimate compliment when no one who was watching the episode could tell that the series' regular director of photography wasn't even involved. Smith was 46 and he led the camera units for several episodes of Burke Law, My Favorite Martian, and Honey West, among others. Okay, now take notice of Kirk's eyes when he is frozen. His eyes move around. This was William Shatner's choice. And I think I have a good shot of that. Um, it's in the other one. There we go. And Fanny says, well, the crew person that did not survive was also wearing red. Yeah, she was a red skirt, not a red shirt, right? Okay, so he believed that since Kirk could still hear Rojan talking, it stood to reason he could still see. And he moved his eyes to convey this, and doing also let the television audience in on the idea that Kirk was frozen, but still very much aware of what was happening. Nimoy and Kelly did the exact opposite. They reasoned that total paralysis meant total paralysis. No one was necessarily wrong here, except perhaps for director Daniels, who failed to get his actors all on the same page. Yeah. So Spock and McCoy are completely frozen, but when he talks to Kirk, Kirk's eyes are moving around. Now, regarding her one-day job on Star Trek, Julie Cobb told Starlog magazine, and actually, she also has another interesting Star Trek connection, which I'll get to here, I think, a little later. She said, I was terrified of doing that show. I was 19 years old, and it was my first professional acting job on TV, so I was very nervous. William Shatner had worked with my father before in The Brothers Karamazov, and he knew it was my first job. He was very kind and supportive to me. In an interview with this author, she added, quote, the whole thing I remember the most about that experience was in those days, because of the nature of film with its development, you had to wear a lot of pancake makeup. You were so caked with this orange pancake makeup that when you looked in the mirror, you literally wanted to die. It looked awful. But the way the film was processed in those days, it looked normal by the time it was screened. Helping Cobb through her case of the jitters, beside the support of Shatner, was the presence of Nimoy and Daniels. Cobb said, quote, I was more than nervous. I was scared. I was in that little mini skirt and that orange pancake makeup, and Shatner was wonderful. He was very serious about the work, but also funny, sweet, and caring. And Leonard Nimoy had been an acting teacher of mine when I was around 16. He was a popular acting teacher in LA at the time, and I was in his class for a minute. Mark Daniels was a great old friend of my parents. He was a terrific man, very reassuring, so I felt very well taken care of on that show. I love how she says, well, I got the job. It wasn't because of my father. But she also mentions, oh, by the way, the director was an old friend of my dad. Hold on. Let me take a drink of water here. Okay. Leslie Dalton said, let me go back to her. There she is. Leslie Dalton said, I thought the sets were quite ingenious. It was very creative, really. And it was interesting because there was no front wall on the bridge when we were filming. So when you're looking at that screen, actually, let me get a shot of her on the bridge. I'm sure I've got one here. Yeah, there we go. She's in Sulu's spot. So when you're on the bridge and you're looking at that screen where they take a shot of the screen, that's what you're supposed to be looking at. But what you're really seeing is Mark Daniels and the rest of the crew and the lights on the soundstage. Dalton was not pleased with her costume. She said, quote, I wore a form-fitting jumpsuit, and I'll tell you frankly, not to detract from the talent of the wardrobe people, but I despised it, and I despised it for one reason only, the way I looked in it. I was not a fat girl, but ever since I'd taken home economics in high school and learned to bake pies, I would make them and, of course, eat them. And so my hips were larger than they should have been. I felt fine from the waist up. Everything looked great, but from the waist down, I was very self conscious. And, I mean, certainly by today's standards, she's not overweight at all. I mean, I never really noticed her having any extra weight. I was sitting at the helm a lot, but they took one shot of me going up the steps to the upper level of the bridge, and they put the camera right behind my butt and tracked me going up these steps, and I felt so humiliated. And I'll tell you what, I had those extra inches off in 6 months, and I've never had them back. Now, regarding director and star and the relationship between them, Dalton said, quote, Mark Daniels wasn't a huggy, kissy guy. He was just forthright and to the point. There was something very nice about Mark, and I quite liked him. But William Shatner was trying Mark's patience. I found Bill to be like a high school kid. He was just having way too much fun. I didn't find him at all obnoxious. He wasn't rude or abusive in any way. He was actually rather endearing, but he was also just kind of boyish. He was very playful and young for his years. And there was this guy who was visiting the set who Bill liked, and he'd go over and chat with him. And Mark would call for a break. But finally, after about half a day of this happening, Mark just blew and started to scream. And after that, Shatner calmed down for a day. The next day, he was back at it, though. Okay, now day 4, filming. Okay, let's see. I think for this scene. Yeah, here we go. Now, Warren Stevens said, quote, we were rehearsing one of the kissing scenes where Kalinda's explaining to me how humans apologize. In the rehearsal, we kissed, and Mark Daniels yelled, no, stop, close your mouth, because I guess they were getting into tongue action or something. And I remember saying, hey, man, this is just a rehearsal. Boucher said being a Hollywood beauty was a mixed blessing. Men are men, and with all that testosterone, and when a pretty girl comes in front of them, well, what can you expect? Yeah, she's a gorgeous woman, or was, so I'm guessing she got a lot of male attention. Okay, day 6 of filming on a Friday. There was more work in the rec room, including the fight between Kirk and Rojan. For this, the wardrobe department came up with a temporary solution concerning Kirk's ever shrinking uniform top. Get to that part. Yeah, there's a good shot. During the fight sequences in Gamesters of Triskelion, a lot of waistline skin was showing each time he'd swing an arm or do a kick or fall to the floor. For the fight here, wardrobe outfitted him with a black t-shirt securely tucked into his black pants under his uniform top. The velour top would rise up as expected, but this time no skin was peeking out underneath. Also, note the makeup used on Warren Stevens in this scene and in the next scene to film for Robert Fortier. While on the planet, as seen in the teaser in Act 1 and even in their first scenes on the ship, the Kelvins are very pale in appearance. As they become more emotional and more human, there's less makeup used and their natural flesh tones are more gradually used. For the latter part of the afternoon, James Doohan and Robert Fortier did their drinking routine in Mr. Scott's cabin. This is the only time we see Scotty's quarters. Decorations include drafting tools, a tartan kilt, bagpipes, and medieval armor, and more than a few bottles of booze. Dorothy Fontana said the most fun of that episode was the Jimmy Doohan drinking scene, and Jimmy made it even funnier. And the other guy was playing right along with him. They were having a great time. The ever reliable Mark Daniels finished on schedule, allowing this to come in under schedule and under budget, which for Star Trek was unusual. Man, I'm at an hour and a half already. Leslie Dalton recalled the first airing of By Any Other Name vividly. She said, I remember sitting with a friend named Victor and analyzing it. And I remember sitting there watching it and saying, oh, Vic, look at that. And I was making notes about how this had to be changed and that had to be changed. And on top of that list, of course, was to take some inches off my hips. It's funny because I thought, don't worry, the whole world won't see it, but eventually the whole world did. Julie Cobb, who was also in front of her TV, said, I believe I was watching with my mother and my boyfriend at the time. I thought it was very well done and entertaining and thought provoking, but I was, of course, critical of myself, of the way I looked in the miniskirt. I was scared to death, and I suppose that worked out, being that the character I was playing had good reason to be scared too. Okay, so this episode didn't do well in the ratings. Normally, Star Trek comes in a distant second to Gomer Pyle, but on this night, it actually was third in both its first half hour and its second half hour, which is less than usual. Uh, Leslie Dalton said, Warren Stevens was a very nice person. He was a doll. He was a lovely guy. I was just impressed generally with the kind of people on that show. Bill was charming and fun. Nimoy was a marvelous gentleman, and so was DeForest Kelly. They were lovely people. Barbara Boucher said, quote, I remember thinking of Star Trek as being a successful show. I suppose that's why I tried out for the part. William Shatner is my only memory. I had a big crush on him at the time, and we went out a few times. Stuart Moss said, playing Hanar was a good time. My only frustration on that show was striking out with Barbara Boucher. After a delightful week in her company, I asked her out to dinner. She just stared at me for a moment, then she smiled and said, but for what purpose? You're an attractive man, but what can you do for me? What was this episode up against? Well, the first half hour was up against Gomer Pyle, which won the night as always, and Operation Entertainment, which was the show on NBC. And then in the second half hour, they showed the CBS Friday night movie, which was The Great Escape, starring Steve McQueen. And actually, they had shown The Great Escape already before. They showed The Great Escape on TV on the season premiere when Amok Time was on, and it crushed Amok Time in the ratings. And then they showed it again, and it crushed Star Trek again for the second time around. Julie Cobb said, I wasn't a Trekkie, but I don't think there were Trekkies yet. It was still too new. But it was a great show, and it was history making ultimately. I have a family connection to Star Trek. I did the original series, and my daughter, who is no longer acting, had her first TV job on Star Trek Voyager. And then my ex husband, James Cromwell, was in the film Star Trek First Contact playing Zephram Cochrane. So it was a family affair, really. So apparently, this young lady, she grew up and eventually married James Cromwell, at least for a while. And of course, James Cromwell also had multiple roles, mostly playing aliens on multiple episodes of like Star Trek, TNG, and Deep Space Nine. And Fanny says people liked The Great Escape and still do. Yeah, I know it was a big hit back in those days. Leslie Dalton adds, quote, "It's quite a phenomenon. I've had day jobs now and then, meaning jobs outside of the acting industry. And when I do that type of work, I don't talk about being an actress. Number one, you don't want them thinking you're going to run off and do acting as soon as you get an opportunity, which of course you will. So I keep it to myself, but every now and then it will come out and someone will know me from a show like The Guiding Light and they'll say, oh, you did that. What was that like? What else have you done? And the minute I say Star Trek, everyone who was not very interested in what I was talking about before is up in front of me asking what else I've done. The effect is amazing. By any other name began with Jerome Bixby, therefore his is the last word on the episode. Quote, it came out kind of a lightweight episode. The drinking contest with Robert Fortier was funny. When he collapsed, I thought it was the best part of the story. Okay, and that'll do it for By Any Other Name. So next week, the episode I'll be looking at will be Return to Tomorrow, which is episode 51 in production order. And what else? So I'll probably be streaming Sunday evening this weekend. I didn't last weekend because I was with my National Guard unit. And I know I've said this before, but my intention is to have a video on the top 5 Marvel villains for the Flash out this weekend. I've meant to get that done for a couple of weeks, so hopefully I'll finally get that. So again, if you haven't liked the stream, please do, and please sub to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you to everyone who showed up to watch the stream live and who will catch it on a rewatch. What's Fanny says? Her marriage to Cromwell was the longest of her 4 at 19. So she was married 4 times. Wow. And it lasted 19 years. Well, I mean, she was a pretty young lady. You know, there's a picture of her in here in the book, in an episode of the Brady Bunch, and she's really pretty. She was quite a pretty girl. I don't know what Cromwell did to get her. It's not like he was any great dashing matinee idol, but he did something right, apparently. Okay, and so streaming Sunday night, hopefully that video out next week or later this week, and then Return to Tomorrow next week. Again, thanks to everyone who watched during the stream and those who will catch it on a rewatch. And I'll see you all next week then, and have a good evening. Oh, what's this? Jeffrey Hoffman, 1 year, Victor French, 2 years. Okay, so those were pretty short. Okay, Victor French, that name's familiar, but Jeffrey Hoffman isn't. Victor French. Oh. Okay, now I got to look him up. Victor French. Oh, that guy. Okay, yeah, I remember him. He did a lot of westerns. He was on he was on Little House on the Prairie, wasn't it? I think he was on there. Or maybe it was Gunsmoke or something. Yeah, he was in Little House, yeah. And Christopher Moran, 7 years. Okay. Christopher Moran. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that information, Fanny. And I'll see you all next week. Everyone, have a good night.